Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Now, there is a lot of ground to cover both in the battlefield and on the battlefield in Ukraine and elsewhere. This was the week of the Vilnius summit, so we got to the second day of that. We'll pick into some of the details of that. Of course, a lot of interesting news out of Turkey, and just the regular topics, updates, and all the regular fronts. Touch a little bit on Middle East, touch a little bit on East Asia, and of course just make the rounds. And I'm sure there's plenty of interesting discussions to be had for the next 2.5 or so hours, however long we manage to stretch out this episode. But buckle up, we got quite a bit ahead of us. Of course, I am Constantine Martelli, joined as always by GSP, and without further ado, I'll hand the reins over to him to give us a clear picture about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine right now.
Thank you. As we record tonight, calibers have been launched primarily from central Ukraine all the way to western Ukraine, Khmelnytsky, Kiev, Lvov, as well as Geranium 2s. Since the last show, there was an attack 2 days ago on Odessa, as well as other regions of Ukraine, including areas of some kind of accumulation of forces in Dnieper, Kupiansk. Although in Kupiansk, word has it that the Ukrainian army is burning official papers and might be in the process of evacuating the city. This has already happened in Chernigov for some reason, so maybe they're afraid of a Russian attack from there as well. Going further west, oh, I almost forgot. The Russians have started hitting Snake Island again, and we'll get into it because this is part of the whole Erdogan drama that has unfolded this week, just before and during the Vilnius NATO meeting. So this was an area that the Russians and Ukrainians both traded a few times, and as part of the grain deal, the Russians left Snake Island alone. But the extension that Erdogan wanted has been canceled by Russia, and if my memory serves me correct, the grain deal was canceled after Erdogan freed the 5 Azov leaders.
Yes, it was
That's
all
the
within
news.
rapid succession of one another.
Yeah. So basically, the attacks on Snake Island are Russia's way of indicating that they're probably serious. The grain deal is done. They don't want any more arms shipments, and basically, the agreement is also a way for the Ukrainians, with the help of the British, to stage attacks on Russian marine vehicles, ships, what have you. So attacks and of course, Zelensky visited Snake Island um, around the time that he went to Turkey. I sent you maps. So the first map is the area of Kherson near the Antonovsky Bridge. The Russians managed to push the Ukrainians out, but then just today or late yesterday, the Ukrainians managed to put in another party in this area. So there's fighting there. There's a lack of, I would say, boats, small patrol boats for the Russians in this area. So, I mean, I don't think the Ukrainians are not planning some kind of invasion of Kherson. Um, these maneuvers are costly for the Ukrainians, but they're there to stretch the force of the Russian military. They're there to tax the system, if you will, so that it cannot, so its eye is diverted from more important theaters of conflict. Moving further west, we get to Zaporozhye, and fighting has been especially the last 48 hours, very intense there. The Ukrainians mounted several armored attacks. There were no less than 3 today. Uh, another thing to note about the last 48 hours, of course, it's in timing with the NATO meeting in Vilnius, and they're there to basically show some kind of an advancement, and none has happened. For instance, in the village of Piatihatki, this is another area where Ukraine has not been able to move past Piatihatki. Um, this village is still in the gray zone. Uh, I believe yesterday or today they lost a Leopard to a 6 tank there. Interesting to see the Leopard tank in that region as opposed to the Orahovo and Vremenovka region, where most of them have been, as well as 2 Bradleys. Now, getting to the Orahovo region, we have more intense fighting. This is where 2 days ago there was a major push by the Ukrainians, wherein they lost 13 vehicles, including 2 more Leopard 2A tanks, at least 5 Bradleys, and several other Soviet era equipment.
Yeah, and
Um,
just to read the text provided with the South Front map that you gave me, it
mhm.
is, since I don't know how clear it'll come up in the recording, but just to reiterate, up to 9 Ukrainian servicemen, 4 tanks, 15 armed vehicles, 5 pickups, 5 artillery systems were destroyed in Zaporozhye, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense.
Yeah. And in the last 4 to 5 days, the Ukrainians have lost 4 Su-25s and 1 Su-24 in this region. So this is more than a reconnaissance and force attack. It is there to gain some kind of ground in order to demonstrate for NATO. But I think, as I've said, that narrative can change. Um, like basically saying that we're outgunned is just as good a reason to continue to arm Ukraine as saying we're winning, right? Um, so there was some incredible footage. We talked about the mining that both armies are doing, and there was an incredible piece of footage just west of Orehovo, where in the Piatihatki front line, where the Russians left a trench with mines in them. And as the Ukrainians went in, some of these mines were remote control. Some of the other mines were personnel mines that were buried just underneath the surface. Very devastating video of the kind of fighting that's going on there. Extremely bloody. Um, Going further west in the Vremenovka area, the Russians are still able to contain the Ukrainians from moving any further down from Makarovka. Now, the Ukrainians did make gains before, and they took the village of Ravnopol, and they have continued to make small advances in this area and around it. So they are now on the ledge, on the higher ground. Uh, Part of the Russian defense is also on the higher ground, but um, it's threatened. So this is an area that's going to be interesting to watch. Some aside news is that Ivan Popov, who is the major of the 58th Army, um, has resigned or has been let go. For a few days, he had been complaining about counter battery radar and that his artillery units are working under extreme conditions, and the Russian MOD had to do something about it. The Russian MOD felt he was complaining too much, and they have removed him. Um, he is extremely popular with his men, so he's very close with them. Remilin 23 basically, put out a message, we are with Popov. In Bryansk, on the Sea of Azov, still in the Zaporozhye region, the Russians were able to counteract the Ukrainians with their attacks of the Storm Shadow missiles. However, one of the Storm Shadow missiles actually got through today, and it appears it hit a Russian command center. There was a Russian officer. I don't know if he was a general or whatever, but he was killed in the process of the attack. Um, to this same end, there was an assassination of a Russian naval officer. Now, he's not part of the SMO. He retired. He resigned in 2021. Uh, his name is Rizhitsky. Rizhitsky. Stanislav Rizhitsky. And it looks like a Sergei Denisenko had murdered him. Now, I've seen the footage, not of the actual killing, but Denisenko's following him while this man was jogging on a bicycle. He fired 4 shots into his back and killed him. And apparently, the Ukrainian GRU had worked with him in order to assassinate this naval officer who's honestly he's not even in the Navy anymore. He's not part of the SMO. So one of the reasons why this might have been not a difficult thing to do is uh, Stanislav Rizhitsky published his jogging on social media, and they figured out what his route was, and in so doing, he made himself a very easy target. Um, Now, moving further east, we get to Ugledar. The Russians have made a gain of at least 2 kilometers to going in a drive going north to one of the mines that is next to the road that leads to Ugledar from roughly the southern Donetsk Marinka area. And this has been a very, very tough battle. The Russians, of course, made a push for it back in late January, early February. That that really well, it failed. A lot of tanks and material was lost, and men. Although we saw large lines of men evacuating from this area on foot over the snow. Uh, of course, there were many losses in men as well. So some gains there. Now, yesterday and today, but particularly yesterday, there was fierce fighting moving further north in Donetsk and Avdiivka. Um, the Ukrainians have been able to push back the Russians in what I would call like 2 key sectors. So Avdiivka is like this long-shaped town. It's right next to Donetsk city. It also has lots of apartment complexes that make it very difficult. The Russians are in the area of the southern part, uh, just on the outskirts. But to the west of that and to the north of that is where the Ukrainians have mounted small but successful counterattacks. However, yesterday, Russia made an attempt to attack from the northern and slightly eastern part of Avdiivka. There is only one paved tarmac road going into Avdiivka. There are several dirt roads too, but only one paved road. You can imagine in the fall, the paved road is going to be the most important road. Or if there's rain, for instance, this week there were 2 days that it was raining. Um, the Russians made an attempt, and basically they lost 8 or 9 vehicles. 2 of them were tanks and several men. They came under artillery fire. Now, I find this is kind of interesting because There's lots of talk about, you get crazy figures like the Russians outgun us 10-1 in artillery, and then it's like 20,000 rounds versus 60,000 rounds. The Americans did get a lot of extra rounds for the Ukrainians to have a counteroffensive. And what I find interesting is I think when you look at the Zaporozhye front, the southern front, this is just anecdotal, but I don't see as much use of artillery by the Ukrainians there as I do in these other key areas. The Ukrainians are really, really, really holding on to places like Marinka, Ugledar, Avdiivka, Artemovsk, or Bakhmut, if you will, um, Seversk. This whole Eastern Front, they are very determined not to lose any more ground there. Because as we've said, now there are a lot of urban complexes in this area that really you can compartmentalize these settlements and say, well, there's only 70,000, or there's only 80,000, or there's only 50,000. But the thing is they're all strung along, and so you really get more of a number of like 500,000 when you include everything, like say from Konstantinovka to Slavyansk. So it's actually a big complex. If this place was allowed to develop, this would become basically one large city with four distinct parts, kind of like in the city where I'm in right now. So um, in any case, a lot of artillery fired. That's basically what drove the Russians back. So loss of men and material in this area. If I'm not mistaken, they managed to take hold of some of the southern western part of Avdiivka, like the area around it, the buffer zone around it. And this has allowed them to begin shelling that one tarmac road. Um, I think this is an area where, the Russians are going to try to focus on, but it's not where most of the drive is is being developed by the Russians in terms of a counteroffensive. That's still in the north, and so I guess I haven't told you, but I've already you've been putting up the maps, right?
Yes.
So yeah, okay, so the last two, ignoring the Ugledar that I sent to you too late. This gives you an idea of the front that the Russians have been developing, especially in the last 24 hours, and they've made significant gains in the area of Lugansk and Kharkov, just north of Donetsk. The Russians have gained new territory in this area of Vozne. Oh, it's covered over. Anyways, it's around uh, it's close to Liman. Um, now they're not as close to Liman as they are to Kupiansk, but they're working in that direction, and they've taken over some of the settlements there, just today. Uh, I'm sorry, it's hard for me to read the name because it's covered over with the arrows. Torske. Yeah, this is just north of the town of Torske, and then the next big town after that is Liman. So um, th- this is an area where I think the Ukrainians are concerned. It is an area where there's been extreme fighting, and there have been high losses for both, but particularly more so for the Ukrainians in this area. And this is why it could very well be true that the Ukrainians might be moving out of Kupiansk. And remember that Kupiansk gets regularly shelled with cruise missiles and fab bombs because it is an important area of accumulation for the forces that are spread throughout that northern front between Lugansk and Kharkov. And That's basically it for the Minutia Minute. The only other thing I'll say is shelling of Donetsk continues regularly. Uh, Belgorod, there was some shelling a few days ago. One of the Ukrainians inside that Russia Freedom Brigade or whatever it is was killed today. The two Azov guys were killed. All of this is in the fighting around Bakhmut, in the surrounding area of Bakhmut. Now, the crumple zones in this area have the Ukrainians have diminished significantly. I don't know how, but the Russians, with the Akhmat Sila Chechen guys, have been able to hold on to Klishevka, and they've also been able to um, hold on to Berezhovka. Berezhovka is a really important place because if they go there, then they can really begin cutting off the salient to the north of it and start really encircling Bakhmut. The other area where the Ukrainians have been successful in this area is further north of Soledar, in Razdolovka. Um, Again, very intense fighting, uh, and that's basically it for the Minutia Minute.
Now, with what we saw this past week, with all of the updates you've given us, especially with the actions on the Ukrainian side, clearly this was a lead up to the Vilnius summit. Ukraine was looking
Yeah.
for a massive showing, which they didn't get, leading into Vilnius, because you had before, during, and now I suppose we're getting to the point after, where every major power in NATO was affirming that membership for Ukraine is on the table, but not in the near future, that there has to be a resolution of this conflict first. And that was the prevailing rhetoric. Now, also in the lead up to the Vilnius summit, on July 7th, there was an aid package that was announced by the U.S., and this included the cluster munitions, which have been discussed at great length, but I'll get into those more a little bit. But just a short list of what was included in the most recent aid package that is going to Ukraine. So that is additional munitions for the Patriot air defense systems, AIM 7 missiles for air defense, Stinger anti aircraft systems, additional ammo for the HIMARS, 31 155 millimeter howitzers, 155 millimeter artillery rounds, including DPICM and 105 millimeter artillery rounds, 32 Bradleys, 32 Strikers, mine clearing equipment, tube launched optically tracked wire guide tow missiles, javelins and other anti armor systems and rockets, precision aerial munitions, Penguin unmanned aerial systems, 27 tactical vehicles to recover equipment, 10 tactical vehicles to tow and haul equipment, demolition munitions and systems for obstacle clearing, 20 small arms and over 28 million rounds of small arm ammunition grenades, and spare parts and other field equipment. So that is the most recent aid package that the U.S. has pledged to Ukraine. Now, as what happens with this, typically what is promised is not always what's delivered for a myriad of different reasons. But once again, this did include the cluster munitions, which were banned in about 120 countries. Now, this doesn't mean these are the first time cluster munitions have been used in the war in Ukraine. And I believe it was credit where credit is due. I believe it was Russians that I could be wrong. They made the observation, which I think in retrospect is pretty obvious, that if the U.S. is sending Ukraine cluster munitions, that means they have burnt through their stockpiles from the Soviet era.
Mm-hmm.
Because keep in mind, just all the former Soviet republics, even some of the smaller, more minor ones, I mean, even like Tajikistan, for example, sitting on massive stockpiles of arms. It was just the way they had their military structured, the way they had their logistics structured, and Ukraine being, I believe, after Russia and Kazakhstan, I believe they would have taken the number three spot for just largest Soviet republic, and then also in terms of administration and the amount of nepotism, the amount of Ukrainians in the Soviet late Soviet government, I would say from Khrushchev onward, certainly, there was a lot of ethnic nepotism for Ukrainians within the Soviet structure. So the idea that they would receive more industry, more military industry, etc., it's getting a little bit into the weeds here. But keep in mind that even though all of these countries did massive sell offs to the third world in the 1990s because of their own economic crises, they still sat on massive stockpiles of arms. And that really is the what we see going throughout the war in Ukraine with the armament, where you have the third largest former Soviet republic, a country that should theoretically, given its geography and resources, be very economically productive and should be a very functional nation. Now, of course, I wouldn't say on par with some of the Western European powers, but given what they had to work with, they fell very hard. And I mean, it's actually, I believe, Ukrainian standard of living has not recovered to the point it was even in the late Soviet Union. And of course, since 2014 onwards, that was just a foregone conclusion that something like that was not going to happen. But you do see this with these aid packages over and over. The replenishing of what should have been massive military stockpiles. Now, as I had said previously, we do have to look at the reality that a lot of these countries, because of their economic woes and because of the quote unquote new peaceful age heading in the 1990s and 2000s, sold off a lot of stockpiles of arms. In fact, Russia had to embark on a pretty substantial remilitarization campaign in the early 2010s, and in fact, probably even to lead up to this war, and that's part of the reason why this war didn't take place in full scale until 2022 was because of the remilitarization efforts. In fact, you saw, I believe it was actually up until 2014, up until the Maidan, Russia was consistently cutting its defense budget. But point being is, these countries had to remilitarize, but the nature of this war, the first real modern war, so to speak, has shown a complete exhaustion of any, I guess you could say, domestic Ukrainian military industry to the point where you need these level of aid packages in order to supplement that. And especially with the cluster bombs, of course, it's it's going to be the double standards it always is.
Mhm.
There are cluster bombs of freedom, the Ukrainians use them. There are cluster bombs of terror, and the Russians use them. But don't be mistaken and think that this is the first time they're being deployed in this war. No, the U.S. is simply replenishing it, and the fact that they're willing to go to more extreme means they are pushing for a more substantial Ukrainian counteroffensive. They do want to do as much damage to the Russians as possible as they try to lead to the next phase of the war, whether that be outright escalation or some sort of ceasefire and truce, which while they remilitarize Ukraine, which I'll get into more as I get into some of the stuff about Vilnius and NATO's plans for Ukrainian membership in the future, the real convoluted mess that they put forward as a roadmap for NATO membership that they've been dangling in front of them since the Maidan, but of course, with the conflict in the Donbass has been an impossibility, at least according to NATO's own rules, but they've been known to bend those whenever convenient. But looking at all of that heading into Vilnius, the summit was far less eventful than what I thought it was going to be, but
Mhm.
the events leading into the summit is what I found particularly interesting, particularly with Turkey, which I'll hold off on a few minutes before I get into some of the news about Turkey and Erdogan's newest stunt, as we can call it, because anyone who's been watching this show, especially for long enough, or have just been following the situation for the past decade or so, knows that this isn't anything out of the ordinary. This is something that's too unexpected, but I do want to dig a little bit into the reasons behind that. But we did see the promising of NATO membership to Sweden as well, and that is expected to take place within short order. You even have Turkey starting to capitulate on that. But just a brief summary of what we saw at Vilnius from the Slavingrad Telegram channel, which I think they summed it up very well. So I'll just give what they had right here. So, point one, an invitation to NATO will be extended to Ukraine once it has reached an agreement among allies and fulfills conditions. The prospect of NATO countries using nuclear weapons is, quote, extremely distant. NATO calls on all countries to cut off all assistance to Russia in a special military operation. Deepening strategic partnership between Russia and China is contrary to the alliance's interests and values. Russian military integration
Mm.
with Belarus affects NATO's regional stability and defense. NATO intends to keep clear channels of communication with Moscow and open and prevent escalation. The alliance does not seek confrontation with Russia, sure it doesn't, but cannot consider it a partner. China's ambition challenge NATO's interests, security, and values. NATO will continue to strengthen cooperation with partners in the Asia Pacific region to address common security challenges. Now, NATO has been trying to open up a liaison office in Japan for the past several months, and that effort has actually been stonewalled by France, in which case, even during the Vilnius summit, you had France once again stonewalling efforts for further integration to Japan. Now, when it comes to France and the Asia Pacific, I won't dwell on this point too long, but what comes to mind is the submarine deal they tried to strike with Australia. I believe it was last September. That story was completely overshadowed within a week by the demolition of Nord Stream, but the US and France were actually in a bidding war over trying to sell submarines to Australia, and the French were acting in a very renegade manner, really trying to assert what power and influence they have left in the region. So, in terms of Macron's overtures to China and his approach towards the Asia Pacific, the idea that France might not want to embroil Japan even further into the American empire as it is, as a NATO liaison office would, isn't a surprise to anyone who has been monitoring the situation. Monitoring the situation. That's a phrase I haven't heard in a long time. I arguably missed those days in a way, but to continue with the summary here, NATO nations agreed to accelerate the integration of outer space into collective security, and strengthening relations with Serbia would benefit NATO. NATO countries will also not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. So, uh, a personal note from the editor of the Slavic Telegram channel, which I find quite, I think fits perfectly, is
Yeah.
note, please choose the most disturbing or absurd statement. Okay, I'm going to do that. I would say the most absurd statement is the alliance does not seek confrontation with Russia but cannot consider a partner, because that's just absurd. But as for the most disturbing, I would say probably strengthening relations with Serbia, because that actually is something that could possibly happen. And with that, I will just make a bit of an aside with some polling data that came out of Serbia regarding the European Union and NATO. So, just a short survey for this was: do you support joining the EU? 46.7% said no, 43.7% said yes, and 9.6 were either conflicted or had no strong opinions. And then the next question is: do you support joining the EU if the condition is to abandon Cosmet? 77% no, 12.7% yes, and 10.3% no. Then the question from a more just will it or will it won't happen is: will Serbia become a member of the EU?
Mm.
54.7% say no, 30.4% say yes, 14.9% have no strong opinion. And then the next question is: should citizens in a referendum express their opinion regarding the French-German plan for Cosmet? 59.2% says yes, 25.4% says no, 15.4% no opinion. And then do you support Serbia joining NATO? And this is where the numbers take a real sharp turn. 84.6% say no, 9.4% say yes, and 6% no opinion. And you have noticed with the recent news coming out of Kosovo, although the European Union has been far from pro-Serbia on the situation, the fact that they haven't written a blank check to Kosovo is a remarkable occurrence, that they are really trying to make overtures to Serbia at this time, that they are trying to negotiate some sort of agreement in order to bring Serbia into the fold. Now, given the contentious recent history
Hmm.
on the topic, NATO is a non-starter for Serbia. It's going to take at least a generation or two before that is even broached. And what NATO will look like, if it will even exist, once again, that's far too uncertain to get into. The European Union being officially an economic cooperative union, I know that's not what it is in reality, but with how it's built, the idea of getting into the Schengen zone, the idea of having the economic integration benefits the European Union, that does appeal to quite a bit more Serbs than, say, turning your country into an American military base, which is what membership in NATO does, as all of Serbia's neighbors have learned at this point, whether it be Montenegro, whether that be, of course, Romania, Bulgaria, are massive NATO bases. Then getting in the situation with North Macedonia. Hungary actually probably is the least of an American military base out of all of its neighbors, but once again, that's also not saying much, and that's because of resistance efforts of the current Hungarian government, which, as we all know, that could very easily implode. Not to take too much away from Orban, but his position, although more stable than most, is also very fragile. It could be swept away overnight if considerable effort was applied to it. Now, they would have to be very heavy handed. The ramifications of that long term with what it means to be a member of the EU and NATO would completely change, but it's something they can pull off if they need to. And then, just to touch on a little bit more of European news before I get into some of the stuff, more stuff about Vilnius and particularly about Turkey, is that there was actually an interesting situation with Romania and Bulgaria with the Schengen zone and the way Austria voted and the European Union's backlash to that. Once again, I'm sure Gunther Fehlinger was very happy about this development. So, the EU sanctioned Austria over the veto exercised against Romania and Bulgaria last December during a JHA Council meeting, which postponed the entrance in the Schengen area. The resolution, started by certain groups representing Romanian civil society, said the veto, quote unquote, discriminated against Romania, which was accepted by EU institutions. Social Democrat member of European Parliament Victor Negrescu demanded that the veto be invalidated and Romania be compensated for financially as a result of the postponement for entry into Schengen. The resolution says that the negative vote worsened the climate change phenomenon due to the increased air pollution of cars waiting in line at the border. It continued saying that increased anti-EU sentiment and damaged the economies of Bulgaria and Romania. The resolution passed today in the European Union Parliament with 526 votes for, 57 against, and 42 abstaining. Austria can be taken to the Court of Justice of the European Union, where they can be forced to pay an exorbitant amount of money for damages. Now, I want you to keep in mind, I don't want to dwell on minor European news too long because there's a lot more interesting stuff to cover in this episode. But I wanted to point out that in particular, where it's just yet another example of how the European Union has a complete disregard for the sovereignty of nations. Now, you had a process completely legitimate within the European Union's governing structure where they ask the members of the European Union and, of course, members of the Schengen zone and other smaller agreements within the European Union. Now, mind you, the Schengen zone is the free travel in between the states that are part of it. Do you want to expand this to other countries in the European Union? In which case, you would think theoretically, the MEPs, excuse me, and the officials in charge of making the decision have the right to decide either way. But as we have learned, if you exercise your veto power, which you do theoretically have as part of this institution, you will be punished and you will be brought before the highest court in the European Union to pay damages. So,
Ridiculous.
that is the. Once again, for Serbia, looking at joining the European Union, opinion polls on that, that is what they can look forward to if they join the European
Mm-hmm.
Union. Of course, I'm sure we don't need to go over the myriad of examples of the times Poland and Hungary have been punished for exercising their own domestic policy in their own
Yeah.
countries, not capitulating to, once again, European courts. Think what you will about their domestic policy, whatever, but it's once again a question of the size and scope of the European Union. What authority does it have? And really, I think these questions do answer themselves. So, to cover a few more interesting points out of Europe, which I think all serve very well as part of the backdrop for the Vilnius summit, just what exactly is going on in Europe. And that's a area that I've liked to focus the show on in particular because Of course, I've seen some people talking about it, that's how I know about it. But I think in this war and in the cascading effects of this war, there's been a distinct lack of focus on the just cataclysmic impact this is having on the entirety of the European continent. Now, that's not to downplay the war and carnage that's going on in Ukraine by no means, but I think we need to understand how much this has damaged what was once considered a potential power block just 10, 15 years ago. So,
Hmm.
around 60% of EU firms consider energy costs to be a major obstacle as compared to 31% of US firms, according to the European Investment Bank. Some details on food consumption. So, according to the, uh, let's see, that was Convera, Italian real food consumption peaked in 2006, and Italian final consumption expenditure, household food, non-alcoholic beverages, and there is a graph that shows it peaked at about 41 billion in 2006, and then it's currently in 2023 sitting at about 35 billion. So just in terms of everyday goods, you have one of the largest economies in the European Union. Now I know Italy has been wrecked with economic issues since '08. You see once again about what $6 billion decrease in amount spent on just basic life necessities, and then some similar data out of Germany and France, where since 2021, food consumption fell about 12 to 13% in both France and Germany. Food prices have increased exponentially in France as well, and that's once again just basic items. That's not including other agricultural goods. That it's just talking about the staples of people's diets. So you have, look, I'm not going to pretend like the European continent is in a state of famine, at least not yet. Who knows? But the amount of people, the amount of money people in first world countries are spending on food is dropping off by 12 to 13%. And we're talking the economic powerhouse of the European Union. Now, because this was EU data, there was nothing about the UK, but I know the UK has been floundering economically, so I can only imagine the data is just as bad, if not worse, out of the UK. But once again, these are the cascading effects of this war. This is what countries that are signing up for NATO, signing up for the European Union, are signing up for. A declaration of economic war in Russia that serves no benefit to them, serves to actually strengthen Russia with the ties it has made outside of the European Union, and has only put the continent further within America's grasp in terms of economic, political, and military matters. Uh, just to round out our European news, German industrial production unexpectedly fell in May, raising fears of a prolonged downturn of the EU's top economy. Now, this is according to the Federal Statistic Agency Destatus out of Germany, and these were reports as of Friday, July 7th. So, a quote unquote unexpected downturn in European Union industry once again. And this will go to India and China, it'll go to the US. And now we're getting to the point where even further, now keep in mind, India has been one of the countries that has gone against the grain, refused to wage this economic war in Russia, and also has coincidentally become a very important economic partner of the European Union, as we have right here. Clearly, the
Could
Russian.
I mention
Yeah,
something?
go ahead, go
The
ahead.
sorry, the Telegraph had to what you were saying. The Telegraph had a headline: India joins Putin's axis of evil. I kid you not. And it's a photo of Putin hugging Modi.
Oh, after Modi had his nice little dinner with Biden, even after all.
Yeah. Remember how they thought they would like, haha,
Guys, India's
Prigozhin
ours.
almost had a coup. It's so over. It's so over. And remember, I said all this will do will entrench because that whole thing. was completely suspect. I don't think any big heads of state really believe that it was even a mutiny. And now we know that a week after, on the 29th of June, Putin met with all leaders of Wagner, including Prigozhin, right? And remember, I said this like 2 weeks ago that for them to be in Belarus is actually really good because it will make it very difficult for the West to mount a coup there. And we know from all the reports we did on Bakhmut that a lot of the Belarusians were in Bakhmut. This was like a big deal. Now they've been all over the place, but they are fighting in Bakhmut. And again, there is that kind of divide. It's not a sharp line, but many of them are Catholic rather than Orthodox. That's a religious cultural to say that there are no Orthodox Belarusians who are fighting to,
Yeah, and
be part of
although
Global Homo.
to
There,
a
there
much,
are.
actually to a much lesser degree than what we see in Ukraine, there is also a
Yeah.
schismatic church in Belarus as well. So that,
I did not know that.
yeah, it's a very minor movement. It hasn't got nearly the attention or support as the schismatic church in Ukraine, but there is one in Belarus
Yeah.
as well. So that also is important to
Yeah.
note.
So yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess in many ways, I think Semigog was right about this. I mean, you and I privately, my feeling was that this was more or less a staged event. Not everybody was in on it. People died,
Yeah, as I said,
but
when it first happened, I don't think this is entirely staged, but there's a lot of song and dance going on. But
there's something fake right from the beginning.
yeah,
Uh, Especially Prigozhin's claim that he lost hundreds of guys. He was just attacked by the Russian military. But I'm sorry to interject.
no,
I
go
will
on,
just
go
say
on.
this. I will, and I promise. I found the name of the Lieutenant General Oleg Tsokov. So Tsokov was the Lieutenant General of the 58th Army, the same one whose major um, quit or was relieved of his duties, Ivan Popov. This is the command that's responsible for the Southern Front. I mean, with all this happening, them being able to like hold on to this area after over 40 days of fighting is remarkable. Anyway, that's all I'll say. That's it for my interjection.
To touch on your point again about Belarus and Wagner, on July 8th, you had Poland move an additional 1,000 soldiers and 2,000 pieces of equipment to the border with Belarus. And of course, this buildup has been happening for months now. In fact, since the beginning
Mm,
of the war. So, in terms of any color revolutionaries returning with their combat experience from Ukraine into Belarus,
yeah.
Wagner is going to be vital in terms of keeping them at bay and any potential. I mean,
Hmm.
the polls outright said that they might have to support a quote unquote popular armed insurrection in Belarus if it arises. So,
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
Poland has been
Yeah.
the main vector for the color revolution attempts in Belarus. So, trying to escalate it into a much more violent and armed conflict is certainly not out of the question. So having the extra legal mercenary, evil, hardened, far right war criminals of Wagner in Belarus cooperating with the government is probably a good insurance plan. I'll just put it that way.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Uh,
Um,
but just to touch on a couple
Go ahead.
last European news before I go on to some of the news about Turkey. So if you want some more ghoulish news out of Europe to prove who's really in charge and who is really benefiting from all of this and who's suffering because of all of this, so Romanian farmers are worried about the state of agriculture in 2023. So, of course, 2022 saw high cost as a result of the harvest, as a result of planting, and the 2023 harvest was it underperformed to say the least. And then this also is combined with the amount of cheap grain that flooded out of Ukraine. And this is, we've seen in Romania, we've seen in Slovakia, we've even seen in Poland, where a lot of small and medium sized farms that aren't owned by these giant conglomerates, mostly these family farms or these uh, smaller conglomerates, are at risk of insolvency and economic failure. And of course, at that point, they'll be bought out, they'll be gobbled up by these larger outfits, which is the goal, as we all know. They hate nothing more than the self sufficiency, whether that be with the farmers, those who raise animals, pretty much the people who produce the necessities of life. They want for them, for obvious reasons, under a centralized system of control. So we actually saw in Romania a number of farmers associations demanding the government organize a Congress for them, and that they wanted to force traders to become quote unquote more predictable in buying grains. And the farmers complained about transparency in the process when it comes to once again the infamous grain deals. Now, not the particular grain deals out of Turkey, but just grain deals in general.
Hmm.
And we did see Daniel Radu, who was one of the speakers at this Congress that ended up being formed, was speaking with the economic minister, well, the agricultural minister, excuse me, Florin Barbu, and trying to get grain traders in the port of Constanta in Romania on the Black Sea to become more transparent and, of course, display their figures in real time, showing the price of grains and the amount of grains. And he also said that the trading apps that the farmers were using, that they use just for day-to-day business, were extremely inconsistent and had a lack of information. So that's just one story out of Romania. There's a myriad of stories out of all of, especially Eastern Europe, with that. And then to top it all off, I think this is the perfect story to top off all the European news with, is that gardeners in the EU are to boost ammo and missile production. So the EU Parliament and Council have reached a deal to, quote, urgently mobilize 500 million euros from the EU budget to ramp up production of artillery and ammo. And of course, they're drawing this away from mostly agricultural budgets. So they are taking away from the basic necessities of life for the average European, whether that be east, west, north, south, urban, rural, taking away from their agricultural budget, taking away from their bottom line in order to produce more ammunition for this war effort in Ukraine. Once again, I can't think of any term to describe it better than a continent wide Morgenthau plan. Just completely crush the Europeans in every aspect. That is what this has come down to. They're going to squeeze every bit of juice they can out of this continent in order to support this war effort, in order to get one up over Russia. Europe is going to be, little by little, chipped away, sacrificed in manpower, in economy, in resources, and hell, even getting to this point in culture and just the stock of the people, in order to support this war effort for as long as Washington wills it. Because that is the dynamic that exists between Europe and America at this point. And they're going to throw everything that Europe has at Russia before they get involved themselves, because once the Americans get involved directly, we're looking at a very cataclysmic situation. I mean, even had the Americans once again reiterating, Biden himself reiterating that, well, if Ukraine joins NATO now, then we'll have a war on our hands with Russia. And of course, nobody wants that. Now, he's very coy about that, as we all know, but they know they can't risk open war with Russia at this point. And with all that being said, getting into just wrapping up some news on the particulars of the Vilnius summit before I get into some of the news about Turkey. So, Stoltenberg made these statements. So, Ukraine has to become closer to NATO. The allies in the alliance are working with it much closer. Quote from Stoltenberg: I expect leaders at the summit to adopt an appropriate package of measures, having agreed to support Ukraine in the long term. We support its entry into the future. All further announcements will take place at the summit, he said in the lead up to the summit. Stoltenberg again called for allies to increase defense spending by 2% of GDP annually. European allies and Canada to invest $450 billion more than they agreed in 2014 in military spending. NATO Ukraine Council will become a crisis management and decision making platform. Quote, all participants will speak on an equal footing and share common problems. I'm sure that's the case. Allies promise to provide Ukraine with 500 million euros for basic needs like fuel and medicine. While, of course, Europe, as it slips further and further into economic crisis, will be denied aid for fuel and medicine, as we all know. We'll also provide for the defense needs of Ukraine, including military hospitals. We'll create a Ukraine NATO Council. I expect that Ukraine will eventually become a NATO member, Stoltenberg. NATO countries will need to increase the supply of artillery shells to Ukraine. NATO's new military plans will include the deployment of 300,000 troops to Europe. And NATO has no position on the use of cluster munitions. Many NATO allies have not signed a convention banning them. And finally, Stoltenberg said, these issues need to be resolved not by NATO, but by the authorities of individual countries. But we are faced with a brutal war, and cluster munitions are used by both sides of the conflict, but Ukraine uses them for protection. The best way to stop all these victims is President of Russia, Putin, and Russia to stop attacking another country, NATO Secretary Stoltenberg said. What beautiful and eloquent words from such a high status and important man. I mean, really, is there anything you can add than the fact that Stoltenberg said it? I think those of you who know who he
I,
is
I,
for the
I mean,
longest.
it's the same mantra repeated in 10, 12, 13 different ways by everybody all the time in the West, right? They're just going to keep drilling it, keep drilling it, keep drilling it. Because I think they just know how the short attention span of most people are, and so on. And I mean, look at how many lies they still repeat about Russia Gate and the 2016 election. Like, they're lies. They've been disproven, right? And they're still repeated, right? They're still just repeated. Um, the storming of the Capitol, two police officers. It's rare, but there are still outlets that repeat that lie. They know it's not true. So, yes, I know. The conflict was completely unprovoked.
Naturally, there was no lead up to this. There was no understanding between Russia and NATO at the end of the Cold War. There was no agreements. There was no burgeoning cooperation in the 2000s that was cut short by color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine. There was no Bucharest summit in 2008 that saw the complete undoing of any sort of spoken agreement between NATO and the Soviet Union and its successor states. None of that happened. Of course, Putin is just high on Russian history. He just wants to recapture glory. He has no greater strategic ends, no greater strategic means. Funny enough, if you talk to some of the more critical sides of the war effort in Russia, who, once again, do, at least in principle, support the war and the quote unquote special military operation, but are still anti Kremlin because of the way it has conducted it, you will hear some similar rhetoric. Now, I give far more credence to one side than the other. And actually, I've been keeping up more with some of, let's just say, the more pessimistic Russians. Now, I know that casts a very wide net, but I think they've had some interesting takes on this conflict and how the Kremlin is dropping the ball. In which case, again, those might warrant going into deeper at some point, but uh, not right now. But I just will say that I have been keeping. I have been trying to keep up with all sides of the argument, so to speak, and trying to keep my mind open when it comes to a lot of these things. So, just put that on public record. But
Hmm. Hmm.
to move on to Turkey, the course this past week saw Erdogan making his normal pivot. Now, I think a little bit of history is required. I'm sure most of you already know it, but just to make everything concise, just to string everything together. So, in 2015, Turkey is very bombastic. It's one of the largest supporters of Syrian rebels. in the Syrian civil war. They were caught on several occasions trading with ISIS when it came to oil convoys. I'm sure you'll recall when Russia struck those oil convoys, which
Hmm.
later led to the Russian jet in Turkish airspace being downed in 2015, which nearly led to a cataclysmic event that was seeing it. I mean, it's actually shocking 2015, 2016, how much wiser the leadership of the Obama administration and it was. I
Yes.
mean, you never thought you'd say that, but Obama, despite all of his faults, clearly wasn't eager to start a world war with Russia, at least on the scale that maybe somebody like Joe Biden is. So that situation was eased, but you actually saw in very short order after that, especially after the coup attempt in 2016, which more than likely had ties to Washington and to a lesser extent several European countries to try to remove Erdogan from power. This was after, of course, the jet got shot down. There was a process of détente between Turkey and Russia. It seemed as if relations were making major breakthroughs at the time. So, of course, there's the coup attempt. Erdogan becomes the wild card that we know him around 2017, 2018. I'm sure you remember when he visited Washington, D.C. and sent his personal bodyguards to attack the pro Kurdish
Hmm.
protesters. What that was an insane situation. I've never seen anything like it. And then it got brushed off. It got swept under the rug.
Hmm.
Turkey went into Afrin, which was one of the Kurdish SDF strongholds, which created a lot
Yeah.
of Western liberal resentment against Turkey, seeing as they were going in against the Kurds. Now, keep in mind, during all this time that Turkey was making these incursions against Kurdish territory, you had the Kurds consistently snubbing negotiations with Russia and the Syrian government, and constantly relying on the support of the U.S., even with Trump in office, where the more they would refuse to budge with the Syrian government, the more hostile Turkey would become towards them because, in terms of actually forming a united front against any sort of Turkish incursions, they were rejecting the most immediate and plausible option and relying on Washington, which has its own myriad of interests with Turkey and in terms of convoluted relations with Turkey, completely snubbing the Kurds at that time. That was 2017, 2018. And then 2018, 2019, we saw very fruitful negotiations between Russia, Turkey, and Iran, and also we saw significant peace breakthroughs in Syria with negotiations between Russia, Germany, and France actually hosted in Turkey, if you do remember.
Hmm.
That went along for a while. Then you had 2020, of course, ignoring a lot of the conflict stuff because that actually isn't too relevant to a lot of this. You had Turkey threatening to open the floodgates with migration on the Greek and Bulgarian border. Europe did seem to form something of a united front. This was January 2020. And you had actually French warships in Turkish waters. Turkey backed down, especially with COVID taking place. International travel was became a lot more difficult process, especially in mass waves of migration. In fact, a lot of the COVID restrictions did curtail mass migration to a great degree, something good coming out of something that it was otherwise disastrous. Then we get into the situation of summer 2020 with Libya. In terms of that, you have Turkey supporting the Muslim Brotherhood backed government. France and Russia were backing Haftar, who was trying to reunite Libya on, let's just say, a much more moderate end. And then you had that. You had what seemed to be really fruitful cooperation between France and Russia vis-a-vis Turkey. 2021 rolls around. Turkey is still making incursions against the Kurds. And then we get in 2022 with the outbreak of the war. So initially, Turkey is issuing fierce condemnations against Russia. It seems like they're going to enter the war in order to recreate the Crimean Khanate on Ukraine's side. Who knows, that might have happened. But what I think happened, now, of course, Erdogan had been leaning more eastward in the prior years to this conflict, but that doesn't mean he completely forsook the West altogether. But what I think happened in 2022 is you saw a policy out of Washington that was very absolutist, very all or nothing, where either you are completely on board with the American Empire's project in Ukraine, you support Ukraine 100%, you're committed to driving Russia out, if not the outright destruction of Russia, or you're pro-Russia. And I believe that is in large part what alienated several nations like India and China, who have strong business interests with both Russia and the United States. And when it came to placing the right bets, they realized we could either hitch our wagons to the U.S., which has shown that in a time of crisis will issue these radical and absolute measures, or we could take our chances with Russia, who we already have a developing partnership with, and actually try to dislodge American hegemony. Turkey, to a much lesser extent, was part of this. And I think they looked at the insane demands coming from Washington, the very stringent demands coming from Washington, and realized that given the amount of leverage they have far more leverage than just about any other NATO member. They weren't going to go along with it. They were going to go contrary to the West, contrary to the NATO, contrary to the European Union, because there was a lot to be gained from it. And with this, we saw Turkey signing several energy deals with Russia, negotiating the grain deal, serving as a mediator for conflict. You recall that the April agreement that was revoked by Ukraine was negotiated in large part with Turkish mediators. And Turkey has also been overseeing these prisoner exchanges, in which case you had Russia release several as high-profile Azov members to be held in Turkey until the end of the war. And then you have, with this past week, Zelensky visiting Erdogan in Turkey, and the release of these prisoners that were agreed to be kept by a neutral third party. And you saw the just complete 180 of Erdogan on several issues, including Swedish membership in NATO. Now, as it stands right now, I mean, of course, they already accepted the Finnish membership. They already capitulated to
Yeah, he's
that.
not going to really stop.
No,
I mean, if anybody was thinking he was going to stand in the way, like,
of course, no. He was going to kick the can down the road as long as possible, and we still see that where he's saying,
yeah,
"Oh, the
yeah,
Turkish Parliament has to ratify it, and we promised to have it done before October." But once again, kicking the can down the road on that. And this is also after the peace negotiations in Syria with Russia they haven't fallen apart, but they have reached a standstill. There has been
yeah.
a complete
He's not happy there.
no, he's not at all. In which case, that's also probably a large part of why he's doing this. And then I'll get into some of the deals with the U.S. and the
I
arms.
think the other reason that he's doing this is the NATO summit itself, because he gets several things out of this, right? He's getting his F-16s that he's wanted. He's not going to, like, does this mean he's going to eventually get the F-35s? Well, I mean, that's in play based on what more he can do. There's all kinds of repercussions, like maybe I think the Russians probably expect that if they underperform or they're looking weak, he's going to apply the pressure, right? Um, the other thing, about Azov, I guess we should mention is there was, this was stated in Turkish media, um, like on the day of after they were relieved, relieved after they were removed from their prison, and this wasn't a real prison by any means, right? So Volin, who's one of the five, says we were kept for almost a month in the catacombs under Azovstal for the sake of propaganda, where we senselessly lost hundreds of our fighters, and probably most of us would have perished there if it weren't for the intervention of the Americans, who reached an agreement with the Russians to withdraw their high-ranking officers from the facility in exchange for the garrison's surrender. This is like, it's kind of nonsensical. Like, he tells you that them staying in Azovstal, like the idea that they're defending it is hilarious. Um, remember how they were begging.
Oh,
Like
absolutely.
Volin's wife or girlfriend met with the Pope. They were begging for them to be released. You weren't holding it. Stop living in your fantasy world. And they lost hundreds. Now he's trying to say, well, there were actually U.S. officers there. And this is kind of interesting because remember, there was that Canadian officer who went missing in Ukraine and he was charged for rape.
And we know that both the Canadians and the Americans worked very closely for Azov for many years, like from the end of 2014. Even Blinken said it. And just as an aside, Blinken also mentioned that they're running low of ammo. So first you've got Biden, Blinken, and then you have President Pavel of Czech Republic, and you have Jake Sullivan. So that's an interesting thing about like where this war is going to go on. They said, we're giving them cluster munitions because we don't have that much else. Interesting messaging. But to get back to these guys, so they're trying to convince you, like, I mean, it is an example, in my opinion, of Putin being too soft because I think he thought he would get something out of this. I think he thought, like, well, if I help the Americans remove some of their officers, which would be a major embarrassment, right? Maybe they won't go that hard. Now, recall that I said last week and the week before that these deals always exist through backdoor channels, right? I'm not going to hit this command center. I know what's going on in such and such place, but I will if you do this. And I'm just saying that the Americans hide behind this like nonsense that's published usually in the Washington Post, but it's published by other periodicals like, Political and the New York Times, etc. Uh, Foreign Affairs, what have you, where they say, oh, we can't we know less about Ukraine than Russia, which is ridiculous. But in any case, so Azov is trying to convince you that they're dying in the hundreds. Like, remember the videos, they're dying of their wounds, literally, and they're running out of ammo, and they're trying to tell you like it was senseless and it was for propaganda, but we would have stayed there longer if it hadn't been for the intervention of the Americans. Like, his statement makes no sense to me. Like, nobody's forcing you to stay there. It's just that there wasn't an agreement that was made, right? You weren't there for propaganda. And like, I thought you wanted to keep this place. Like, which one is it? You surrendered it. I mean, it's ridiculous. And of course, let's not forget uh Metropolitan Bartholomew. Oh my God. I won't I The words I have for this man, I only say in private. I will not say on this show. But yes, Metropolitan Bartholomew, who helped with Mike Pompeo set up the non-canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church instead of the canonical, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Um, he met with these guys. In fact, he took them into one of the three churches that I think he presides over. That, like, I spoke with George Macmillan, and he says that he thinks this one is the one that's close to the Blue Mosque. Anyhow, um, so I mean, come to your own conclusions about Bartholomew. Okay, it's pathetic. It's, pray that God gives us a better metropolitan than him. So, anyways, I found this whole thing from top to bottom very annoying about the Azov guys being released. Um, Another example. I'll grant it that it was in the first 4 months of the war, or first 3 months of the war. Hopefully, Russia has learned some of its lessons. It appears they have learned some. But I think they're still in many ways too soft, and too soft doesn't have to be bombing them harder. Like, it can be these sorts of things, right? Because they're never going to keep their word. Um, Anyways, because America can always can hide behind the actions of the Ukrainians. They will blame the Ukrainians. They blame them for Nord Stream when everybody knows Ukraine does not even have the capacity to carry out something like that. If they had that kind of capacity, honestly, they would. The Russian fleet might not be in the Black Sea anymore. Like,
Oh
it's
no.
preposterous.
Yeah, the the only thing limiting the Ukrainians is not any sort of internal restraint, but means to do these things.
Mm.
And to touch on just some of the points that Erdogan had made in his meeting with Zelensky, we saw almost immediately afterwards Russia and Putin canceled a scheduled meeting with Erdogan that was scheduled to take place within the next few days. And of course, there's the BRICS summit taking place in South Africa, which is a member of the ICC, which of course does have that arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. But we'll see if it's actually enforced. Some people expect Putin will not go. Just given the schedule, I don't think he will, but I don't think it's because of the arrest warrant. I just think that there are bigger fish to fry. And Erdogan, after having met with Zelensky, just a myriad of things happened. So there was expressed support for sovereignty of Ukraine and negotiation of the conflict, etc., etc., etc. The release of the Azov guys happened almost immediately after this, and no less than a day after this, you have Washington greenlighting the F-16s to Turkey. Now, Turkey has been in fierce negotiations with Washington for several years now in terms of expanding its air fleet. So, of course, it was a key member of the F-35 program, that disaster, and they felt
Mm-hmm.
because of that they were due at least F-16s, if not the F-35s themselves. Now, frankly, they're probably better off with the F-16s knowing what we know about the F-35. F-16 is a very fine aircraft, and especially for a nation like Turkey and its size and its scope, the F-16 is plenty for what I would
There is
imagine.
some breaking news to this,
Yeah, go ahead.
to what you're. Yeah, so this just popped up like literally a minute ago. On Sweden's NATO membership delayed 24 hours after the historic agreement. Erdogan has backtracked, quote unquote. Just this morning, we wrote that despite loud statements and approval from Turkey, Sweden's path to NATO is at risk of being delayed. Thus, the US Congress is in no hurry to meet Erdogan's demands for the supply of F-16 fighter jets, and the Turkish leader himself may at any moment try to bargain for better terms, dumping everything on the um, Mejilis, which must vote to approve Stockholm's application. The day has not had time to approach sunset, but the Sultan has already started political maneuvers. Turkey's parliament will not approve Sweden's application for NATO membership before October. Erdogan said at a press conference following the alliance's summit in Vilnius. Uh, Turkish president explained such a distant time frame by the fact that the relevant bill will be submitted to the Medjilis for the consideration only after its opening, which will happen in the autumn. In addition, Erdogan said that he expects Stockholm to fulfill its commitments to fight terrorism. Sweden will have to provide a detailed action plan within the framework of previously adopted agreements. As we said, the Turkish president will try to squeeze maximum concessions out of the situation, so he will see examples of Erdogan's classic multi-vector policy. It's vital for the alliance to show unity, blah blah blah, on and on. So he's doing his little delay tactics. I mean, it is going to go through, but I do find that interesting, right? This was not a great uh, NATO summit. I guess we'll get into it later, but that's it. That's all for my interjection about this. I just thought it was worth mentioning.
Oh, certainly, and I do think that we also need to address probably what is a lot bigger of a topic than arms shipments and F-16s, which is Turkey's sudden interest again in joining the European Union. So this was something that was
Yes.
this was one of the key foreign policy goals of the Turkish government since the inception of the European Union up until about 2015, when things really started to freeze over between the two. And what we have here is Erdogan trying to play a tit for tat game, saying that of course Sweden should have membership in NATO. Of course we can concede to that. But we believe what is equally as important is Turkey seeks European Union membership. And this is from Telegram channel Bellum Acta, which I think also has great coverage, brought up some interesting points about the ramifications of Turkey and the European Union. Now, with Turkey and the European, with Turkey within the European Union and the Schengen area, now one does not necessarily come with the other, as we've seen with some parts of Eastern Europe, in particular with Romania and Bulgaria, who had their ascension to the Schengen area snubbed. So, but still, to continue, it would still make migration far easier, even if not in the Schengen area, I think is the point. This means 7.3 million, 3.7 million, excuse me, Syrian immigrants and tens of thousands of immigrants from Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central and Southeast Asian countries can now move freely to the European Union via Turkey. Noteworthy that the European Union only has 1 million migrants from Syria, so if we're to believe the official figures, Turkey has about 3.7 more migrants from Syria than the European Union does. Now, this also opens the door for infiltration operations by Turkish intelligence and affiliated groups such as the Grey Wolves, who have made their mark on the streets of several major European cities, particularly Vienna. They have been functioning as, once again, just another street gang against target communities of the Turkish government. This could be distant groups who are more in line with the Kemalist ideology, Kurdish diaspora, those in league
Gulen.
with somebody like Gulen, and so far as he's relevant. But point being is those who find themselves contrary to the Turkish state, and that will be, of course, far easier to access within Europe because there's a lot of Turkish diaspora, a lot of Turkish distance within Europe. If really applied, all key figures of the Gulenist movement, as well as the PKK and affiliated groups based in Sweden, will be handed over to the Turkish government on terrorism charges, thus the dismantling of most relevant far-left organization of the Kurdish diaspora and the Turkish anti-government organizations. The possibility of the radicalization of Kurdish communities as well as Armenian and Assyrian communities previously welcomed by the Swedish and Central European social democratic governments will become the topic of further negotiation, given that détente between the European Union and Turkey will be perceived as a stab in the back by them. With integration of Turkey into the pan-European logistics system, it can be concluded that the Turkish economic situation will stabilize in the medium term, taking into account no major events happen on a regional global level. That's a big assumption. Which will not only have a political afterlife, which will not only give Erdogan a political afterlife and his neo-Ottoman project, but will fully aid in the final solidification of his control over Turkish politics and social institutions. So to speak, if applied to the quote-unquote tip of the pencil, is without a shadow of doubt a total victory for Turkish diplomacy. Time will tell. Now, I like the analysis there, but it is very speculative because that's assuming, number one, we even get a Turkish ascension into the European Union. That's assuming we even get the agreements that would be a prelude to something like that. Then that also assumes entry into the Schengen area. Then that also assumes that with entry into the European Union, Erdogan being allowed to remain in power with the further encroachment of European institutions into Turkey, his grasp on power would become far more fragile. So, now I'm sure he has some sort of contingency plan against that. Perhaps this is just a bargaining chip that he's willing to give up, something that he's not quite that serious about. But once again, when it comes to the economic stabilization it could offer Turkey and the amount of aid that would pour in from the European Union, it is a pretty lucrative prospect to get Turkey in the European Union. Go ahead.
Well, I think also if you take a look at as you say, the prospect for Turkey entering into the EU, on a formal basis, not just talks, but the actual process. Uh, that's about 2 years away. My guess is Erdogan suspects that by then the war will have come to an end. And that might be the opportune time for him to become part of the EU. Now, I don't know how. I mean, granted, like the EU will take just about anybody now as long as they're anti-Russia. But the EU is looking also for guarantees. And I mean, Erdogan would have to get in a struggle session with the EU about how the EU cannot infringe on, the way Turkish culture is. It's a much more masculine society than that of Europe's or America's. And, it's dubbed as authoritarian. So, like, you know, corrupt elections are fine, but there is a culture that will have to change.
And
In the way that you're seeing it being changed in places like Latvia, who elected their first openly gay president. Like there will have to be some substantive pieces of evidence indicating that Turkey is moving in that direction. I don't see Erdogan doing that, uh, but maybe he thinks this is a struggle that he can win. Maybe he thinks Russia will win, and therefore Europe will not have a strong hand in bargaining. And of course, behind Europe, of course, behind that sock puppet is America itself.
I also want to point out that with the ascension of Turkey into the European Union, that would make them the most populous state within the European Union, supplanting Germany only by about 1 million people. And then I think the next
Mm.
largest two, if I have my figures correct, Italy and France are about 60 million apiece. So already you would have a member state joining, be, overtaking the first place for population. In terms of economics, I don't think they outpace the the big four within the European Union, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close there,
Yeah.
and especially with the amount of economic aid that would come in from Europe, they would probably see, as that post said, stabilization in the medium term and economic growth as well. And in terms of the institutions, as you had said, of course, it's far easier to force this on a country like Latvia. And even Poland, which serves its purpose and serves its purpose very well, they still hang this over Poland's head. They still try to force these changes through. Now, much less aggressively because they know what they need them for. But Turkey would be an entire different nut to crack because
Oh yeah.
this is a country. Now, I'm not. Poland, Eastern Europe didn't have the traditional liberal revolution, so to speak, as say most of Western Europe did, where liberalism really became ingrained in society. And I mean, just looking at the history of Eastern Europe from the 20th century on, where that's pretty clear, especially considering the fact a lot of these countries didn't even exist at the beginning of the 20th century. It only existed once again at in any real form at the end of the 20th century with the way the cards shook out. But even now, they're hardly sovereign, and it's a little bit of an overstatement to consider that these are. Look, we've had this discussion about the weasel countries before. I'll just leave it at that. But Turkey is a country that underwent a very unique liberalization in that period of the 20th century because with the formation of the Turkish Republic in 1923 with Ataturk and the so-called secularization of Turkey, it was, especially in a time as you moved on 40, 50 years, in a time of unrest and religious rivalism in the Islamic world, whether that be in the Gulf with Wahhabism, whether it be the Iranian Revolution, whether it be these various jihadist groups that popped up and eventually, of course, caused full-scale war throughout Iraq and Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, etc., etc. Turkey was always touted as an example of what the ideal secular Muslim Middle Eastern country could be. And they were that way for decades. Now, of course, anytime any central authority would become too powerful, you'd have a coup, in which case the military usually would, in very short order, return power to the civilian government. But even now, you see with Erdogan and his rise to prominence, the undoing of that liberalism and secularism that was ingrained in the 20th century. In fact, I wouldn't say it's nearly as extreme as say what happened in the Gulf states, Iran, etc., because the process has been far more political than outright force of arms or violence. But what we're seeing out of Turkey is it's taking the trajectory of a lot of these Muslim countries in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that reverted far more to religiosity and became far more fervent in their Muslim beliefs. That you're starting to see that happen in Turkey, and that they're rejecting a lot of the quote unquote secular Western values, as of course those have completely imploded in on themselves. And it's becoming a much more formidable force and formidable nation in that regard. And Erdogan has the institutions under pretty tight control. I'm not saying it would be impossible to infiltrate them, especially once European economic advisors and economic aid and everything that comes with the package of being in the European Union. Once that shows up, I'm sure entry into the institutions would become far easier. Not easy, but far easier. I think there's a very important distinction to be made there. And with that, they're opening the door for Turkey to once again become this secular liberal republic. Now, that's on defense of some sort of devoutly Islamic state. I've made my thoughts on uh, that very clear in the past. I think all of you know very well where I stand on that, and in fact on the Turkish question in general. But looking at this just completely objectively, just removing any personal opinions or biases from this, what we're looking at right here is probably the most illiberal state in the European Union if this does come to pass. I mean, we're talking even more illiberal than Hungary, more illiberal than Poland. And of course, you could make the argument that with the decline of Western states, with somewhere like France and Germany and the way they treat their populations, it doesn't exactly resemble liberalism, at least in the classical sense. But again, I'm talking 20th, 21st century liberalism that it rejects a lot of the redeemable qualities of liberalism, such as perhaps more trust in the individual to live their own lives, insofar as you think that's actually a good idea, and focuses just more on the social and institutional aspects of liberalism, just to uh, clear that. But with Turkey, with a country that didn't quite have the same sort of liberal revolution, for lack of a better term, that a lot of these Western countries did, what we're looking at is, as I said, the most illiberal country within the European Union. And then that would also require the delegation of MEP seats that would become a major voting bloc. And also, just given what we know and given the way things have functioned, once they're within the European Union, certainly when it comes to Turkish diaspora in places like Germany, the Netherlands, mostly the Central European countries, I think France does have a degree of Turkish diaspora, but not as much as, say, like Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium,
Hmm.
etc. What we would see is those blocks become even more powerful. I think the Green Party in Germany is the most popular party with Turkish diaspora. So you would see those sort of blocks form. And then that's also not to mention, especially with the prospects of countries like Bosnia and Albania joining the European Union and just being adjacent to the European Union in general, the emboldening of, let's just say, much more hardline Islamic and possibly nationalist movements there, especially as the situation in Serbia is what it is. Who knows what Turkey would take on the Kosovo question had that broken up, because once again, we know Kosovo is one of these countries that's just European Union adjacent. But what we're looking at right here is it's showing why Turkey is a fundamentally dangerous country in many more ways than one, and why the Western diplomacy around Turkey, keeping it contained and pointed with its sharp end pointed at Russia for these decades, was a feat of foreign policy mastery. Of, once again, back when, as much as you may disagree, the Americans had a competent foreign policy, uh, just in general. And
Hmm.
looking at that with the powerhouse that they built Turkey up into, because they needed Turkey to be that powerhouse, especially in the Cold War and especially in an event of war with the Soviet Union, watching that possibly be turned inward on Europe. I mean, frankly, although they would have to deal with some of the more illiberal elements, that sounds like, once again, just another pressure point the Americans can apply to Europe when it comes to just completely subjugating this continent. Now, once again, Turkey is a lot more of a renegade state, hard to have that control over, but there's a lot of situations they could play to their advantage with Turkey and the European Union and a lot of these events coming to fruition. And also with that, we're talking about agreeing to sanctions packages on Russia, which would be another one, but that will also assume that the war is still raging on as it is, and the economic tensions that exist between Europe and Russia still exist. And look, I'll just say, even in the event of a ceasefire or some sort of tentative peace, barring just a complete 180 in European governments, most of the sanctions are going to stay in place. They're too valuable
Mm.
not to for the people who they're important to, the American empire, their proxies in Brussels, etc. So to think that they would dodge that, maybe they would make waivers and exceptions for Turkey as they always do. But once again, I'm not saying Turkey is going to be pulled fully westward again, but it is making its westward pivot. In which case, this is a very dangerous and volatile time for countries to be making pivots like that. In which case, let's say overnight, let's look at the course of the rest of the year, the next 6 months going into beginning 2024. The war with Ukraine and Russia escalates. You see more and more NATO involvement. And as more and more NATO manpower, resources, and money gets pulled in, that of course is going to include Turkey, especially if Turkey is trying to kowtow to the West. And after a certain point, you burn your bridges, and there's no way to get that back. Russia also does
Yeah.
have so many points of leverage it can use over Turkey. We have the pipeline agreements, we have the nuclear plant agreements. Once again, you could have Russia threaten to axe these, or actually do put to axe them. So you have that, but also conversely, you have control of the Bosphorus Strait and access from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, which has been, as we know, with the grain deal, a very contentious point here. So right now, although I'm not saying Turkey is going to flip back completely to west, Erdogan is doing what he does, what we would expect him to do, which is this balancing act, which is playing both sides off each other. He's doing it in a much less stable, much more volatile world, not only in terms of economics, not only in terms of political situation, but once again, we're talking the largest war since World War II happening right now, just north of
Hmm.
Turkey, in two countries that it shares a major sea with. Uh,
Yeah.
I don't think the volatility of the situation can really be understated here.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that, and you know, I remember this in the early 2000s, about plans for, because it was just after the Second Chechen War, plans for a pipeline from the Northern Caucasus, Azerbaijan, through Turkey into Europe, right? This plan is that like 20 years old or more. Back then, it looked like it was going to be a possibility, and I don't doubt that, you know, the CIA funding of the Chechens was to facilitate that. Um, the other is last year, Kazakhstan signed a deal for a pipeline that bypasses Russia and goes into Azerbaijan. I guess the other question will be, you know, there's still Blue Stream and Turk Stream. Both emanate from Russia, and you know, they go into Turkey. Turkey sells it to other nations. Um, the end of 2024 is going to mark the end of many contracts that Russia has with various European states. Spain will be one of them. Spain in 2023 bought the most amount of gas of any country in Europe, for instance. Um, so it's going to come down to that, right? Like, how fast can they develop that? So I think pipelines, looking at Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, all of this is going to become really important in order to figure out what Erdogan will do next, because there's a very strong likelihood that after the contracts end, you know, Turkey will have to buy that gas in rubles. And Erdogan might be thinking long term, he won't want to do this, but in the short term, he'll put up with it. And he could get, you know, funding from the Europeans anyways if Turkey indeed actually becomes an EU member. Then the question arises, will he accept the euro? You know, Bulgaria has recently agreed to adopt the euro just after Croatia did. I mean, the funny thing, it's a very ironic dynamic that's happening right now, because on the one hand, um, the EU has been in stagnation for some time, especially after the economic crisis in the US, which affected them worse than the states, or the states would say, I mean, let's be honest, the states just printed more money, right?
EU member states cannot just print more money to get out of their problems the way America can, because they don't have world reserve currencies the way America does, or to the extent that America does. So um, it's a question of like inertia, but also this kind of inevitability, right? Like, yes, it's inert. Yes, the standard of living is going down, but the momentum, despite the inertia, the momentum is that you should join the EU,
Yes.
because there are these major blocks developing. Now, is Erdogan really serious about that? I mean, he handed them the best optic victory that they could even hope for. Remember, Biden did not stay for the dinner at NATO. Um, Zelensky, of course,
Well, it was
made that
past his
tweet.
bedtime. What did you expect?
Yeah. Zelensky made that tweet about how NATO is absurd, how they didn't even get a timeline. I think they're very upset, particularly if the war continues to get bad. Um, you know, the best news to come out of this is really everything that Erdogan has applied for them. He freed Azov. Azov met with like Metropolitan Bartholomew. They Sweden has been given the green light with strings attached. That's the best that they can hope for right now, because the counteroffensive has been a failure. Even on the weekend they tried to knock out the Kerch Bridge with a storm shadow that failed.
Yeah, and I think like you said, the optics of this cannot be downplayed, especially with the past 4 years at least of what seemed like immense improvements in Russian Turkish relations. And I know with Turkey, it's you have to be very careful when you talk about these things because there's a lot of song and dance involved, even more so than other countries. But it looks like almost all of that has just been squandered overnight. This looks like the
Oh, I
Erdogan
know.
that we saw before he shot down the Russian jet, frankly. Minus the military operations in Syria, which who knows, those could reignite. I that situation is also extremely volatile. Now, you also have to look at the angle where the Arab League and Saudi Arabia in particular have completely reconciled with Syria at this point, so it could be posturing against them, posturing against the Gulf states and just the Arab world in general, where you've had that. So the situation in Syria, of course, is not as dire as it was even just 3 or 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, especially. But if he's going to court Washington for the next 3 to 4 years, like he's courted Moscow for the past 3 to 4 years, or court Washington for the next 3 to 4 years, I should say, then we could very reasonably expect to see flare ups in Syria, flare ups in the Black Sea, some very dangerous games being played with the Bosphorus Straits, and, of course, much more room to demand concessions from the European Union in general. And I'm thinking of particularly the three European Union states, which all have very significant border crises with Turkey. I think Cyprus being the premier one. The disputes over water access in the Greek islands is another one, and to a much lesser extent, disputes over the border with Bulgaria, where you
Mhm.
already have the right wing Greek prime minister now, just to show the effects of what European politics has become and the just sheer amount of the American empire's influence. Just days after being elected, of course, pronounces that gay marriage will be legalized. And once again, you can't escape these things. Latvia, the gay president, it's the civic religion of the American empire. It's nothing you can escape if you swear fealty to these people. It's just reality at this point. The Hungarians, the Poles, to a lesser extent, are completely justified when it comes to domestic policy in that regard. But I mean, this is the future that any country that signs itself to the European Union, including Turkey, probably has to look forward to. Now, maybe for Turkey, it's a little bit of a return to tradition because you recall the first country to officially legalize homosexuality was the Ottoman Empire in the 1860s. But I'll leave that. I'll put that to the side right now. But with what we have here is you already have the bureaucrat politicians, the usual suspects from these countries. I think it was the Greek prime minister who did come out and say that, oh, we're expecting a new era of peace and cooperation with Turkey, which means we're going to give in to the concessions that Brussels and Washington tells us to give in to, because that's the way it has operated for decades now at this point. And that is the leverage that Turkey has over that. Of course, there was a brief 180 as Erdogan got closer to Russia and started acting more renegade. But if we're going to assume that he's going to play a much more balanced act, now, once again, a lot of this is very speculative because I will once again say, with how volatile the situation is, we could see in a week to a month to 3 months from now, Erdogan is sounding like he did maybe at the end of 2022, beginning of this year. So, but once again, that arguably makes things more dangerous when we don't have a consistent line from Erdogan and he's flip flopping much more. Now, I don't want to make comparisons between the situation because there's far too many differences, but I will just say on a surface level, you recall that Lukashenko was courting the West shortly before the 2020 color revolution in Belarus. Now, Turkey has a lot more sway, a lot more pull than a country like Belarus, but as it becomes more brazen, Turkey is going to exhaust the patience of both sides involved here. Now, the question is whose patience will be exhausted first, what measures will be taken to it first, but it's a very lucrative but also very dangerous game. And I will once again remind you this is in the backdrop of a major war that could very easily escalate to engulf much more of the continent.
I mean, it's possible. NATO is, with America's leadership, is dedicating. They want 300,000 troops close to the border of Russia, so they'll be stationed in Poland. Uh, I'm sure they're there to basically threaten Kaliningrad, Belarus, and the possibility of entering into Western Ukraine. Duda today mentioned at Vilnius that there's a very real likelihood that Poland will go in to Ukraine at some point. Quite a provocative statement.
Oh, especially, and I mean, coming from Duda, that's not a surprise, and I think it's more of an inevitability at this point. I have been strongly speculating once again that Poland, it's an inevitability when they get involved in this conflict, if this conflict does continue, because there's no other aces up their sleeve than that. This is the next move of this conflict.
Mm.
Now, it could include Poland, it could include Poland, Romania, and Poland, Romania, a few other nations. But point being, it's going to be this Eastern European quote unquote coalition, the willing. Uh, Look, I know it's trite to invoke his name, but I don't think it can be said without doing so. Referencing exactly what George Soros wrote in 1993 about convincing the Eastern Europeans through the fighting against Russia for us, at a time when we were supposed to be having a détente and rebuilding relations with Russia, mind you. This was what was coming out of the Open Society Foundation. By the way, Soros recently, I believe it was about 3 weeks ago, handed over full control of his operations to his son Alexander Soros, who is,
Mm.
by all understanding, his father's son, but far more radical than his father and far more willing to
Mm.
assert himself. So we can look forward to more of that influence on both sides of the Atlantic. I don't know. Hopefully, he'll end up in Hungary and the arrest warrant will be carried out. But I'm not getting my hopes up on that end because that's far too optimistic for of a appraisal of the situation when it comes to looking at just the power and influence of the Soroses. I mean, it would. Could you imagine if Hungary arrested either of them? It would be worse than the South Africa release Mandela from jail nonsense. I'm without a doubt. Uh, it would be it would be such an anti-Semitic horrible act. Any nation that would do so would face the full brunt of it. I mean, I know that the arrest warrant for Soros, not to dwell too much on it, is mostly a political stunt, but just thinking about how unviable it is a little disappointing to say the least. But
Mm.
what we have with this is I don't see a way this war doesn't escalate. And I'm not saying that because I just want
Mhm.
to see it all burn. I frankly Look, I've toyed around the accelerationist idea. I'll tell you, after seeing some of the acceleration happen, I don't like it. And frankly, I don't think it's viable. I don't think there's a way out. I think it's just going to get worse. I don't think there. I think, funny enough, okay, there's nothing humorous about this, at least in the conventional sense. So I'll spare you the word funny. But strangely enough, the more unstable it gets, the more stable it gets for them. Because in fact, the people in power relish in the crisis. They relish in the chaos. It actually gives them a lot more opportunity to seize and manipulate power the way they see fit. So this is what we're looking at. And like I said, unfortunately, unless there is a very decisive Russian success in this war in the near future, I'm not going to put a time frame on that. We're probably going to see this war escalate with the involvement of Poland and possibly other countries. In which case, it ticks the clock even a little bit closer to midnight, to use the overused analogy. And that's not something I want to see. I don't think that's something very many people want to see. But especially with Biden in the White House and an election year coming up, and the legitimacy of the American empire being called into question, and that's not even getting broached the situation with China and Taiwan. And the U.S. already said that's running short on ammo, so trying to ramp up ammo productions and the possibility of supporting both these conflicts. We can see very radical moves out of Washington, and very radical moves out of Washington ordering its proxy in Europe to do very dangerous things, especially with the political legitimacy of Biden on the line and an election year coming up. Not just Biden, but the entire American empire, where they have put themselves in a now or never moment. This is their time to prove themselves. This is their time to deliver on all the promises that they made upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. A beautiful, peaceful, liberal world where we crush all tyranny and war and evil. It's just this very messianic portrayal of the American empire that it has taken upon itself for the past, once again, 30 years here. We have this blemish of a war in Russia and Ukraine on that reputation, and then a potential war in East Asia to even further that. So they need a desperate conclusion to this conflict that is even the slightest bit in Ukraine's favor, something that they can paint it, that they beat back the Russian aggressor, that peace and democracy and liberalism prevailed once again. They need that so desperately, and if they do have to escalate to get that situation, if they think they can, I fully believe that they will. Am I talking conventional full-out war between America and Russia? No. Am I talking even the nukes flying between America and Russia? Certainly not at this point. But what I am talking about is more and more proxies out of Europe, and it will crawl westward as time goes on if the situation is allowed to continue the way it is.
Mhm.
With what we're seeing there, it's a disaster in the making. And really, like I said, short of Russia having a decisive success in Ukraine in the near future, I see no means of prevention for that. Perhaps the body bags coming home to Poland, to Romania, to these stations would do that. But even then, that's still tens, if not hundreds of thousands more lives you're throwing into this meat grinder. And that's also assuming it won't have the exact opposite effect of further increasing desire for war and violence in the population as their men come home, that the need to avenge them and live up to their sacrifice, etc., etc., etc. So it's not a situation you want to be in with this much at stake. And I know I've been doomsaying for the past year and a half now about the situation of Europe, whether that be economically, politically, etc. But we're looking right now at the trifecta: politically, economically, military, that Europe is completely engulfed in crisis. I don't want to see that happen, but
Mhm.
with each passing day, as I follow the stories, as I collect the notes for the shows, as I talk to you, I'm sure you know this better than anyone else when it comes to my opinion on this, because once again, you're the person I talk to most about this, that with each passing day, I become less optimistic about the situation of Europe not being completely engulfed in both metaphorical and literal flames.
Yeah, I know. I said last year that this is going to be a long war. Uh,
It seems to me that everything is on the line. Just this week, the Guardian, Tinsdale, I think, is the one who said. I mean, essentially, he said it would be better for the war to escalate than for NATO to lose in Ukraine. Um, Completely like uh, the statement of a crank. Um, you know, he basically means NATO cannot afford this defeat. The West cannot afford this defeat because the fact of the matter is they are afraid of looking weak, and if they look weak, then they're afraid that they're going to lose more. Like, yes, they are lying to people when they say that Russia is planning to advance on Europe, and I mean all of that is nonsense. And you barely hear that kind of stuff anymore anyways. But I think what they're afraid of is long term, if what if they feel that they have to provoke them, or a different leader uh, is leading the US and causes another provocation. Or maybe it's a European leader that the Americans will have to support, or rather than lose face. That's what they're afraid of. So the longer this war goes on, the more that there can only be one definite side that wins. The only thing that gives me hope currently is, like I said, the statements over and over again. That could be it could be a psyop, but when Sullivan, Blinken, and Biden are all saying within 3 or 4 days, we're sending this because we are running out of ammo. This is over and above the newspapers in the West, um, Economist, Financial Times. These guys are real. Like, those two papers are very much like, um, the thing I learned this year is that they're very much the establishment, deep state publications. I knew that about The Economist, but I was less familiar with the Financial Times. But when you look at that, they had interviews with that Russian Freedom Brigade or whatever, literally hours after they committed these murders on the Russian side of the border of an elderly man and children, like they're in contact with them. Okay, they've known about them. They didn't learn about them that day. So they're very deeply entrenched. And so again, the only hope I see is based on the publications that are making these statements, and even statements like Sullivan and Biden made these statements on camera. Granted, Biden said it in passing as he was leaving the room, but that might indicate that they want some kind of a pause, let's say, by November, December of this year.
Now,
Because there was a forecast that ammo would begin to like really dry up in about 3 months for the Ukrainians. As I said, more was given, but more has been used for the front. And maybe the reason, anecdotally, it appears to me that the Ukrainians are using it more in Donbass and Kharkov than in Zaporozhia. Maybe that's an indication that they don't they need to keep the Russian army at bay in Donetsk, even more so than in Zaporozhia.
now, I think it's interesting that you brought up the Financial Times and the assorted government officials who have talked about the ammo shortage, including Biden. And I'm not going to outright disagree with you. I think you make some fair points there. I think if there's any point of hope, that would be it. But there are a couple of things that give me pause about that. I'll just put it that way. Number one, I just want to start out. I think it's funny that at least in recent months, I feel you've become the optimist of this program. Who would
Well, I mean, I did. There is a caveat that this is all
No,
just a
that's
trick, right?
tongue in cheek, tongue in cheek, but
Because
still,
when Macron at Vilnius said, "We're going to give Ukraine long-range missiles,"
yes.
Le Monde literally like 6 hours later said they're already there, right? Like Tokmak was hit with a cluster bomb today. Uh, but I thought the cluster bombs aren't showing up for a few more weeks. They're already there. Like we've said this many, many times over, right? If they say they're going to give them, they've already been in Ukraine for a few weeks.
Oh, absolutely. And what I will continue saying with what you had said is, at least my interpretation of the statements. Now, I could be wrong, and if you do know, correct me if I'm wrong. What they're referring to in particular is our stockpiles are being rapidly depleted, because they are. Our weapon stockpiles are being depleted. But I've mentioned this before, and I think it bears repeating. If we're to believe this war is of greater consequence, okay, not even us. If Washington is to believe their own propaganda by their own line that this war is of greater consequence as they're saying, would that not logically follow? And I know expecting logic out of these people is a little bit of a stretch, but bear with me, please. That we begin dipping into what our active personnel are using in terms of supplies to send to Ukraine. If we're to believe that this
Mm-hmm.
war is of as major consequence for the West as they say it is, in which case I'm somewhat inclined to believe them, not entirely, but somewhat inclined to believe them at least, then would it not follow that they begin dipping into the active arms stockpiles? I mean, I'm pretty sure there's some European countries that have already dipped into the active arms stockpiles, that we do see this. And also, another point of apprehension I do have about this is, with them saying, oh, we're running out of stockpiles, that also does create the fear that, well, if we're running out of reserves to give them, then perhaps it's the time to mobilize the weasel countries to go in to bolster the Ukrainian war effort. Now, perhaps those two things are unrelated, and perhaps one might happen without the other. It's possible, but I do think that it creates more of an opening. Well, if the situation is that desperate in Ukraine, they need somebody to be the windfall for them, somebody to come in and to secure the line at least. Now, once again, that's pure speculation, but I could be wrong. I fully admit, but I'm pretty convinced that Poland entering this war is an inevitability. Could be wrong, but
Mm.
as it stands now, with what I have seen, now how that will take place, what that will look like, that remains to be seen. That's to be determined. But it's it's it seems like a foregone conclusion, at least to me. So you do have that, but I will say, and I'll remind everyone once again, as I always mention with this, that this did not come from the Pentagon leaks, but these were statements that were officially released by the Pentagon. That if there wasn't any major Ukrainian success by autumn of 2023,
Yeah.
Washington would lean on Kiev to enter into negotiations. But once again, that also reaches the impasse. Will Russia negotiate? What motive they have to negotiate? What is the mindset of the Kremlin? I feel like, despite everything, the Kremlin would be open to negotiations, because although Putin is enjoying a high popularity rating, although the Russian economy is weathering this crisis and actually seeing higher growth than Germany, for example, it still is, to return to that word, a volatile situation for the Kremlin as well. This is something that could very easily escalate, something that could very easily become a a real burden on Russian society, even more so than it already is. And I know the burden
Hmm.
has intentionally, through the utmost effort of the Russian government, has been kept as light as possible. I mean, for example, only 3% of GDP spending has gone to this war. But as it escalates, and as we see the situation start to metastasize, I think that's a proper word for it, it's very reasonable to expect that Russia will have to dedicate more manpower, more resources, more finances to this war. And some would argue that they need to now if they're going to secure victory. But although I don't think Russia is on the brink of collapse or losing or anything, although I do think they still do control initiative in this war, I also, at the same time, think just with who is in the Kremlin and what their policy has been thus far, that they do want a diplomatic solution to this even after everything. And whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'll leave it to you to judge. I have my
Mhm.
opinions. I think it's a bit foolish given everything that we've seen thus far. But I think there's still. I think the conciliatory wing of the Kremlin is still the strongest wing in there and strongest faction there. In which case, if we're to see Washington lean on Kiev for negotiations, we could see the Russians very easily agree to these terms. Now, perhaps after the April treaty was violated and the Ukrainians pulled out of that, the Russians are more weary of negotiations, but that hasn't stopped them before. I mean, keep in mind they had the revised Minsk, and then even after Minsk II was broken, they entered in. They at least tried to enter into the April peace treaty. So the idea that Russia, especially under Putin's leadership, is exceptionally conciliatory isn't an absurd factor to take into consideration all of this. And I think that despite the propaganda that they have about that they have about Russia, that they have about Putin, a lot of guys in the Pentagon and the White House and in just the halls of power in general are banking on Putin's conciliatory nature in order to see a,
Mhm.
let's just say, semi-favorable outcome for the West to this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, the thinking of that for sure. Like, one of the reasons why Russia is fighting the way this war and the way that it is they want to take out the least amount of money and be the least onerous as possible. And this is why it's just soaking up 3% of their GDP. As you know, their economy has picked up. It's doing very well. If you consider Russia part of Europe, it's the best performing economy right now. Uh, Considering it's fighting, honestly, the biggest war since World War II, uh, and easily so, then it's doing quite well. I mean, one of the things that the West wants is to escalate the war in some way without it affecting them very negatively, right? So it's kind of it's escalation and containment at the same time. And the reason why they want it is twofold. One is it will create a greater economic burden, which you were already alluding to and mentioning. And the other is if the death rate goes up and it looks like there's no solution, the Russian people will turn against their leadership class and Putin, and therefore, you know, fait accompli. Um, that's what they're, that's the overall strategy, right? Because if America was really prepared to win this in a classic military sense, and you would have to imagine Britain would have been part of this, then all the urgency, even by the Trump administration, to spend more money on NATO, to build up their weapons stockpile, that would have been heated. And this is why I always said um, last year that all this stuff by Merkel and Hollande saying, "Oh, it was just a trick," they're just playing like it was not just a trick. Okay, they were sincere. They were sincere back then. They're being insincere now to look like they are with the current thing in geopolitics for the West, right? If they were serious, they would have spent more money on weapons, and you know, uh, Ukraine would have had more weapons. Uh, at the moment, the capacity for the U.S. and all of Europe cannot meet Russia's capacity, and they know this. And so it was an entirely different strategy that they chose. Um, they betted on the fact that Russia, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has also become consumerist and kind of a more shallow society like the West. And the tolerances for suffering have decreased rather than increased, right? And this is why when, Prigozhin made the so-called attempted mutiny, you had people like Anne Applebaum, right? Like, you know, 1917 is potentially repeating itself in Russia, right?
Oh, wouldn't
Just absurd.
Applebaum love that?
Yeah, of course. Yes, Applebaum.
Um, so um, I think that's their strategy, right? Their strategy was we're going to economically cripple them. We don't have to invest all this military stuff, right? It's kind of like I don't know, like the way liberal democracies are going. We were talking about this off air before we started to record. Like no matter how dumb and stupid Biden looks, and I know that aggravates like over probably well over 50% of the American public, but in terms of like the elites, while it's not ideal, what it does represent is this in liberal democracies, the state is itself what is totalitarian, right? And it can function in a way irrespective of the president, right? Even a baffling guy like Biden, right? Who really is not able to make a coherent speech, right? Most of the time, not some of the time, but most of the time. And
Life, liberty, and you know the thing.
right, and the thing, yeah. So for them, basically, they feel like they've already established America's already established its culture globally, and really the next step is just to wield soft power, sanctions, um, media, right? So most of it is not kinetic. Most of the strategy is economic, financial, and cultural, right? Uh, I think like what Russia is doing is disturbing them in such a way that I always said like when the rubber meets the road, like a lot of this stuff kind of loses sway. And now the West, particularly America, is able to will be able to create a narrative and all kinds of distractions so that a year or two later it'll be forgotten, right? Just like Afghanistan is a long, far gone memory, even though we're basically on the eve of its second anniversary, which is not that far back.
I'll tell you
So
this much, and as somebody who has this program week in and week out, I didn't even realize that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's how much. And I also will point out with in terms of distraction, American political discourse heading into 2024, for obvious reasons, is about to become much more debased and simplistic heading into an election year, a
Hmm.
presidential election year at that. It is going to become exactly like what we saw in 2016, 2020. Not that those are unique election years by any means, but again, Americans always use election cycles, and every election cycle seems to get more absurd, more petty. But heading into that, more ridiculous, personality driven politics is going to come to the fold. In which case, I mean, that's perfect. That lets the administrative state function with relative impunity because people are less focused on that. As you were saying, it doesn't matter whether the individuals in the seats of power are necessarily competent themselves. This thing is, dare I say, well-oiled machine that is self-sustaining, that can function itself because the institutional and bureaucratic power is just so entrenched that now, I mean, you could make arguments about the degradation of the, let's just say, foot soldiers of the American bureaucracy and the administrative state. That might be its undoing, but for the time being, it's functioning as well as it can at least. It's running a global empire, so love it or hate it, you got to give it that much that it's still functionally capable of doing something like that. Now, how viable that is in the long term in terms of the personnel there, I think that remains to be seen. Perhaps some of the things we saw with the Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action are hedging against that, trying to open up a little bit of a door to that. So, uh, once again, I could speculate on that all day, but we would be here for several hours if that were the case, which I prefer to spare you at least on that detail of minutia. But I do think you have made a fantastic point, both when we were discussing this off air and just now, that ultimately it doesn't matter. Biden as an embarrassment can be tolerated. Lackluster presidents can be tolerated. But although they can also be tolerated to a much lesser degree, somebody like Trump, especially, I would say early Trump, defiance and outright questioning the system while in said seat of power, I
Mm.
think, is what they do not want. That's why they did not like Donald Trump. I'm not saying he accomplished any great thing in his tenure, policy wise or anything else, but the fact that even as he became more neutered in his the later half of his presidency, he still was quite defiant even going into 2020. Especially if you're going to believe some of the behind the scenes things that happened, which I think that there's about a coin toss chance of most of those being true or not, and really just it's up to personal opinion at that point. But his defiance is, I think, what made him so dangerous. Not anything else about that, not any substantial fear, but the fact that,
It's his rhetoric.
yeah, the
It was
fact that
always his rhetoric.
he's willing to ask why. Why is this the case? And
Mm, mm.
one leak that I think that sticks out to me in particular, if it's to be believed, I believe it was March 2021, where some Pentagon official was bloviating about Trump, and could be true, could not be true, but I'm inclined to believe it, where they were discussing East Asia strategy and the topic of Taiwan came up, and Trump more or less said, "Well, what are we supposed to do if China takes it? It's 2 feet away from them. It's an entire ocean away from us." In which case, once again, I think he expressed it very, very. He went very much against the grain, so to speak, when it came to that,
Yeah.
asking that sort of question.
I mean, he wanted to withdraw troops from Kosovo.
Yeah, I remember that.
Like, we're getting all these stories now, right? So, I mean, obviously he was hemmed in to make quite an understatement. But yeah,
I remember, and it's funny because, especially now that although Trump has been unsuspended from Twitter, it still is. He filters a lot of what he wants to say through proxies, particularly his son, Donald Trump Jr., is one. And you'll recall during, especially the later part of the Trump presidency, that he would use him to make, at least in my personal theorization, he would use him to make a lot more bombastic statements through his proxies, in particular him, where I think it was his son actually said that, well, we should just withdraw troops from Kosovo altogether. So he actually outright said what shouldn't have been said, while Trump was kind of mealy mouthed about it, as one would have to be in a
yeah,
situation like that. So it is interesting when you listen to
you're
Trump's,
right.
yeah, when you listen to Trump's proxies, what they say and with what they can get away with. It, I, yeah. So, but once again, to hammer home the point, it's the defiance of somebody like Trump. Not, I don't think that's unique to Trump, but the defiance of somebody who would get into that position of power, I think, is what they fear the most. Not anyone who is actually out to dismantle or restructure the administrative state, because they're pretty well entrenched. That's a Herculean task. Nobody's really going to accomplish that shy of, let's just say, very radical methods, which I don't necessarily endorse, of course, to put that on record for the show. But I do think they fear somebody who drags their feet and just asks too many questions while in the seat of power.
It could be because like it appears like the West is going through some kind of a transition. Like definitely, like standard of living is going is going down. People are noticing that, and they don't like to hear about that, right? Um, because there are at least two generations still alive that like remember a very different kind of West, a very different kind of America. So they're hoping you don't notice, right? And they're hoping that, you know, ideology will trump um, the kind of inevitability of lower standards of living.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I actually saw something that I wanted to bring up that happened this week that I think touched on some of your points about Ukraine and forcing negotiations. So there was a press conference with Matthew Miller from the U.S. State Department, and he was speaking to one of these talking heads from the press who said, and he had said, this war for has been a strategic failure for Ukraine. The journalist suddenly corrects him, no, you mean Russia. He said, ahem, excuse me, a strategic failure for Ukraine. So,
Yes.
although that is a story that I don't think will get much play and really doesn't carry much significance at the end of the day, you're still having one of the big wigs in the State Department admitting that more or less the Ukrainian project has failed. And although I would need to see more instances like that and more press coverage of these sort of events, I do think what we're seeing right now is I think they're at least thinking about priming the pump in order to convince Americans that de-escalation in Ukraine is the next move. Despite what I was saying about some of the things coming out of Europe, but I think they can simultaneously be true where you have at least a seeming American disengagement from the war while a further European entrenchment. In fact, actually, if you go to Donald Trump when he was, if you recall the survey that Tucker Carlson put out to all the declared Republican candidates, when asked about his position on the Ukraine war, that's more or less what Trump's position was, that America needs to back off, Europe needs to bear the burden of it. Now, of course, given the dynamics between America and Europe, if Europe's bearing the burden, it's just America is bearing the burden in a much less direct way towards that. But I do think that could be the strategy going forward where it's something that is shelved in the mind of the American public and more onus is put on these American proxies in order to conduct this war effort with American support, of course. Of course, America is going to have a blank check for them insofar as the resources allow. But I do think, especially as we're going to get into a very debased, simplistic, personality-based politics going into the 2024 election, and as the looming threat of China continues to grow, you're going to see the Ukraine issue not put away completely, but shelved. Much like how
Yeah.
I think you will see on a domestic level, a lot of the, for lack of a better term, I hate the term, but it's become the common parlance for it. You're going to see a lot of the quote unquote woke stuff, at least put to the side, not put away, but put to the side. They're going to touch on it far less than they might have in, say, in previous years. But we're going to see this on domestic and foreign level, that a lot of their more radical policies are not going to cease. They're not going to stop. But they're going to be operating in the background as just another facet of the administrative state, while the Americans focus on their debased personality contest. And I'm not saying that is anything particular to Americans. I think any country that has mass democratic elections falls under this category, but I do think that having really innovated it, at least in the 20th century onward, Americans do take the cake for absurd electoral
Yeah.
politics.
Yeah. I mean, it's literally called a circus. But
Yes.
um, I would say Vilnius, this NATO meeting that just wrapped up, in many ways kind of set the precedent, I believe, for, let's say, a certain direction that the war goes that will not be in favor of Ukraine. And that is that, they've made it okay to isolate and reject Zelensky. That photo on stage, for instance, right?
Wait,
The
hold on. I
con
think I have the one you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
I have an edit of it. I'll just put it that way. Where? There it is. They don't even know I'm the president of Ukraine.
Yeah. So so you had Ben Wallace. Now Sunak is claiming otherwise, but today Ben Wallace said, you know, it took me 40 hours to get to get to Kiev to meet with Zelensky the first time, and I didn't. The very first thing out of his mouth was what they needed, right? He didn't even have the grace to properly greet me and be thankful and so on. So, like, yeah, there is trouble in paradise, but that doesn't. I mean, like, it's like Ukraine is a project, right? Like Ukraine signed up to die for a much bigger strategy that really was about destroying Russia. And Ukraine thought, yeah, I like that part, and I'm probably not going to die doing it. But you are, and you signed up for it. So they can take this failure, like I said earlier. It's ironic that despite the stagnation, the EU still has this momentum, right? Where Turkey, if you take it at face value, is interested in becoming part of the EU. Now, so this kind of criticism of Zelensky, right? Only the most hardcore supporters are going to back him, but they've made it okay to criticize Zelensky, to criticize Ukraine. Like, dude, isn't 120 billion enough? You know,
Keep in mind, these things were unspeakable just a year ago, especially going
right?
into the Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2022. Unspeakable that anyone would say this about Ukraine or Zelensky in particular.
Yeah, like I don't think guys like Ben Wallace and Hodges are doing some incredible 4D chess. Um, when they say that, or rather, when they said last year that they expect Crimea to be in Ukraine's hands by summer or autumn of 2023. I don't. I think they really believed it, right?
Oh no,
I think they
I
looked at,
think so too. But just the statement on his face is
yeah, it's
laughable.
ridiculous, right? So, um, and Ben Wallace has been like a really stalwart defender of Ukraine and getting Ukraine everything that it needs and more. Um, but I'm just hearing more of this kind of talk, right? It doesn't mean that the West is going to relax. It doesn't mean that the war against Russia is over. It just means it takes pause. And like I said, Ukraine signed up for it. Everybody knew that as soon as Zelensky gave the order to begin shelling Donbass in early February of 2022, that it was going to provoke Russia because it had amassed an army that the militias could not stop.
And keep in mind,
They were going
this
to
was the
lose
second
Donetsk.
amassing
Well,
of this was the second amassing of Russian troops in the border just within the
yes,
past 12 months at that point. Because you had the incident in 2021 and April 2021 where this exact situation almost played out, but it eventually de-escalated.
yes,
So
that's right. That's right. It was like literally 9, 10 months later. They were in. Well, I mean, the buildup began in like late October, early November, but nothing really happened until late February. Um, and this is kind of interesting, right? Because Russia kind of refused to help um, the people in the Donbass, but it was actually Gerasimov that apparently was the advisor for a defense strategy to keep Ukraine away. So I know he gets a lot of criticism, but that was interesting. Um, in any case, uh, like I see there's definitely a potential, right? Um, there's no question that the alienation that Zelensky was subject to was because of his tweets, his frustration with NATO, right? Because his frustration with NATO is not just that the arms aren't happening fast enough or they're not big enough. You could say all of that is true, right? Um, but his major beef is if you guys don't enter, it's over for us. And in many ways, now with the Azov fighters freed, like if he can't have any hesitancy, he has to be willing to do what they want to do, and they will go down fighting to the end.
just the last point I want to bring up before we wrap the show is I just want to just bounce an idea off you, off the audience. Now I know this speculation has been going on since the beginning of the war. The idea that Zelensky would be either overthrown or supplanted in some other way by more radical factions in Ukraine. And of course, with the amount of support he had from the West, especially early on in the war, he was untouchable. Nothing was going to happen to him.
Yeah.
But now, seeing the way he was treated in Vilnius and seeing
Mm.
the way the summit has gone, and the fact that Ukraine is at least supposed to have 2024 elections now, it's been outright stated by Zelensky that we'll have elections once the crisis is over. But it does make me. So I don't think there's going to be Ukrainian elections, is what I'm getting at. But what I do think what we might be seeing is the preparation to replace Zelensky. Now, will that necessarily be in a coup or by violent means or by his assassination? I don't necessarily think so. But maybe a golden parachute for him when they put somebody new in power? Perhaps. And especially if they do get a ceasefire. It, I, I think one of the best case scenarios that the West could look at is they get a ceasefire before the end of this year. They're able to organize sham Ukrainian elections. I'm sorry, legitimate Ukrainian elections, because no election ever has ever had any fraud or any foul play in it or any sort of illegitimacy to it. They organize those for 2024. They get, let's just say, a much more competent actor in power. Pun completely intended, by the way. And then wait for the war to reignite, possibly with this Ukrainian rump state in NATO. But I do think that's also part of forcing some sort of tentative peace, is if they can have that long enough to replace Zelensky by quote unquote legitimate means, that would probably be a boon to it, because I believe, especially at this point, he's become far more of a liability than an asset, and that there are likely better options within Ukraine to replace as the head of the Ukrainian state.
Yeah. I mean, it's we'll just have to wait and see. I don't see it just now. I think it's
No,
still
no.
too early to tell. Uh, I would say probably in a month or two, we're going to get a clearer picture, and probably in 3 months, I think we'll know for sure. Um, it just depends. How low is Ukraine really running on shells? I think that's going to
Try
be
manpower.
yeah. I mean, the Germans have said that they're going to send more of their anti-aircraft systems over for air defense, more Madars, infantry fighting vehicles. I don't know how many they've lost. Uh, of the 60 Leopard 2A tanks, like about nearly 20 are gone. So about 30 to 33% of all those tanks are gone. The tanks that they are going to get will be the Leopard 1 variant, and those are the ones that were created in the late 60s, and they have thinner armor than even the T-72s, the T-80s, the T-84s, the T-90s that you see there, even the T-64s. They're not as formidable, and you see that the British have warned the Ukraine not to send the Challenger tanks into battle, right? I mean, that says everything. Even though the British today promised that they would send more shells for their Challenger tanks. It's odd, right? Like, it's not a huge package, and we've said it before in the show. The package that they received for the spring summer offensive of this year was less than what they received the year before. You could argue that it was a lot more NATO equipment rather than you know uh, Soviet era stock that was given to them from various countries, and a little bit of modern NATO equipment. I mean, you I guess Ukraine is going to find out that um, it's not that sacred in the heart of the West, right? Like, it is, at the end of the day, it is a proxy against Russia, rather than a concern in and of itself.
Of course, that's what it's always been. I think that's what anyone with any degree of rationality has said. But just as closing thoughts on all of this, just looking at the Vilnius summit, the main event of the week, the main attraction of the week, with what we had during this, it was really. I said, show before we did this, that we will have a much clearer picture of the direction of the war in Ukraine depending on what the NATO heads say in Vilnius. And with what we saw, is we saw a very middle of the road approach. Of course, Ukraine can join NATO; it would just be at an undetermined point in the near future, but we guarantee they'll be in there. Of course, we continue to support Ukraine, but we're not seeking to escalate this conflict with Russia, at least officially. That's what they said.
Yeah.
And they took every cop out they could while still supporting the war effort. In which case, that signals that they do realize the predicament they've gotten themselves in. They do realize what they have to do in order to accomplish their own purported goals. But the enthusiasm, the means, and the willingness to do so has completely evaporated. And that they are really looking for, in my opinion, just about any off ramp where they can come out looking like they have accomplished anything. And actually, I know Turkey, we spent quite a long time discussing Turkey this episode. It does remind me of the predicament that Turkey found itself in with Syria, where they were just looking for anything they could claim as a victory so they could just go home and put it behind them. And I know the situations are on far greater scale, but I do think there is an element of that there where they, at least temporarily, now I don't think we've seen the end of this by any means, not even close, but they are looking for something they can at least call a temporary victory while they have a pause, they freeze the conflict, and they reevaluate, realizing that now that they have an idea of what Russia is capable of and how Russia will conduct a modern war, what do we do from this point? And however they develop from that remains to be seen, of course. But in terms of point being is the status quo cannot continue. There is desire for escalation. There is desire, in which case I do feel like if this war is allowed to continue past the autumn, just to give a general time frame, we will see Poland and possibly other states get involved. But if there is some sort of off ramp that is taken, we're going to see a severe restructuring of the West, both domestic and foreign policy. In which case, that's probably going to be disastrous for all of us. Expect crackdowns at home far beyond anything that we've seen so far. And in terms of foreign policy, expect a much more aggressive posturing. Depending on how the situation with China plays out, perhaps the focus could be shifted there. But realistically, at this point, the best option they have, short of outright intervention in the conflict, is ceasefire and rearmament of Ukraine under whatever terms of the agreements that they get. And I don't know if the Russians do choose to enter negotiations, it would do them well to be adamant to press the point of Ukrainian neutrality. Although we've seen before that can be violated, but it'll at least buy them some breathing room. But I think I have to repeat what I've been saying throughout the entire show. The situation is volatile and far too volatile for my personal comfort.
Yeah.
But that's all I had. If you have anything else on the agenda or any final thoughts, certainly.
No, no, that's it for me.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode of the War Report. We will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.